Welcome to Saturday of our Voices of Faith and Leadership in Cody, Wyoming. And welcome to our Zoom people. And welcome to Mary Keller. She's our teacher today, professor, speaker, companion on the way. I like that. So here's her website. Mary is a professor at UW, teaches online. So that's cool. And she's got all this fellowship. She's the adjunct. I'm going to read the big paragraph.
Okay.
All right. Mary Keller works at the intersection of feminist theory, post-colonial theory, and indigenous studies theory in order to study the relationship of religious lives to the struggles for meaning and power. She teaches Introduction to World Religions, African Spirits in the New World, African American Religious Culture, and Gilgamesh to the Bomb. I want to see that. Keller emphasizes the geographical, historical, and social context in which religious lives are embedded, and then focuses on questions of personhood within religious traditions. Current research examines the role of sacred land in a world of global capital, money, and agency, and recent developments in theory and method in the study of spirit possession. Which all of which sounds like she's right up our alley as the part of the Interfaith Network here in Wyoming and as a Voices of Faith and Leadership. Mary Keller, we welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you. So that's an awesome introduction. Thank you for that. And I think because I would like to cover a lot of ground with you today. Let's go ahead and just pull up the slides. And I will ask if those of you who are here have taken any time to look at Heart Mountain. Since you've been here, you know it, you know how to, okay, all right, great. Because that's where we'll be spending our time, is thinking about that mountain and what it means as part of a heterogeneous, so a kind of multicultural landscape. And so one of the things I've been doing with Wynn is to, and let me just make sure about my timing for today and what you're expecting for this so that I keep myself within.
We have about an hour.
That's right. Great. Okay. Just wanted to make sure.
Go over just a little bit, but.
Didn't want me done in 20 minutes.
No,
right.
no.
I'm sure you have more than 20 minutes worth.
I do. So one of the things I do with Wynn is I partner with Wynn to run the books for an annual event that we call the Return to Foretop's Father. So one of Heart Mountain's extra names is Foretop's Father. I shouldn't call it an extra name. It is one of the Apsalica or Crow names for the mountain. And I'll tell you the story about why the mountain is called Foretop's Father in just a minute. And so as a question, you guys are all established, hardworking community leaders. As a question to me, part of the value of being able to present today is to think about what kinds of alliances are ready to be forged in Wyoming with regard to Indigenous presence on the land. And that this example is one of those where in Wyoming, there's not a bit of Wyoming that does not have Indigenous stories that preceded settler colonial stories. So the great news is anywhere you are in Wyoming, there's an opportunity for partnering with an Indigenous community who likely have some members at least who are interested in building alliances. So the Return of Foretop's Father is an annual event. My strength is in thinking theologically, comparatively. That's where my strength lies, in trying to bring different worldviews together to think about how does that world look? What does time look like in that world? what does the relationship of humans to the land look like in that world? And what kind of insights do we gain from looking at more than one of those worlds? And I would call this living in a world of worlds. So that where many of you might be in your leadership in terms of the tradition you're living in, you also know what it's like to navigate a world of worlds as being different persons in your families, different persons in your community, having to navigate what it means to be a person of faith in a largely, let me just say, consumer-driven culture, where your values regarding stewardship and community might not feel like they are the foundation of what drives a community. So it can feel like you're swimming upstream sometimes. So I think that living in a world of worlds, what I haven't done is specialized in Christianity. So instead, I'm a comparativist. And that's part of what I'll be doing today. The wonderful thing about Anne Marie is that she recognized one of my weaknesses, and this is why we need alliances. And she helps with things like, what is a budget? And how do you plan ahead for using them? And so let me just say the value. I would also say that at this point in my career, I'm 60, and I love working in teams. I love the fact that you guys are a cohort. I think that connectedness and having different strengths come together is pretty exciting. All right, so I'm going to tell you about this annual event.
It may take a minute for it to.
So this event started when I came back. First I'd done, so I'm from Wyoming. I had been a wilderness ranger and ski coach and things like that after college. The mules, as a wilderness ranger, told me that if I was going to continue singing and talking about Hegel, I should find a second job, or perhaps a career that.
For those of us, you might explain who Hegel.
So George Frederick Hegel, a philosopher whose idea of a philosophy of consciousness, of world consciousness, it was very important in the Enlightenment as a model of how one self and another self co-create a third space that goes on to, so that it relates our identities into networks of potentially conflictual, but potentially collaborative growth. And so I went back to grad school out in Syracuse, and out of grad school, I taught at the University of Stirling in Scotland for 5 years. And then moved back to raise kids in Wyoming. And you guys might also recognize why that's a good thing to do. Where am I going with this? That I had been trained to think from both feminist theories and post-colonial theories about the meaning of persons in place. And so when I came back to Cody, I wanted to think about, can I do what I do in Cody? And it brought me, because I like to start with the land and how the land orients people, and the fact that when you look comparatively, we know that things like mountains orient communities, whether it's Mount Fuji, Mount Kenya, that things like mountains orient communities because they have a kind of power on the landscape. They make weather. They push you to your extremes. They organize the water of the landscape. Things like that, that mountains have a power that orients communities in literally how people move, and often in terms of, I lift mine eyes to the mountains, a sense of a kind of power in the mountains that is a good experience to connect with. awesome in its capacity we are a pretty feeble animal compared to many of the animals on mountains. And so it's an awesome power that both draws and can threaten humans. So I went to the Buffalo Bill Historical Center and the archives, and working with their librarian, Mary Robinson, started pulling up stories of landscape. And she brought me to some recordings with Grant Bulltail. So he is an Apsalica or Crow elder who was an educator always and wanted to share stories that he thought had the power to address and heal humans in our time. So he felt like it was very important to share these stories, and he was always seeking out people in finding a dearth of interest in his own community, which suffers from the kinds of what is called lateral violence that can impact reservation communities. Finding a dearth of people as interested as I was in his stories and telling his stories and recording his stories. So we made a good team. So this is Grant Bulltail. He was a US Marine who was in Vietnam. He came back from Vietnam to get a bachelor's of science from Montana. And he started into a folklore degree at University of Utah with Professor Fife, who is famous in the world of American folklore studies. And he went on to have a career that included time with energy companies and then back to education, back in Billings and on the reservation. And that's how our collaboration started, because his great-grandfather, let's go ahead to the next slide.
Just how do you pronounce the tribal name again? Apsalica?
Apsalica.
Apsalica.
And that's I think one of the exciting spaces now for anyone in a leadership position is that the indigenous names, tribes are starting to care about naming themselves and using their own names. So it's hard, we stumble over the words. They don't.
So is this a name?
For Crow.
It's the original name for the Crow.
Oh, Crow?
That's the original.
It's the original name, and it means children of the large-beaked bird.
And the large big bird.
Large-beaked bird.
Which is?
To Grant, he thinks that bird no longer is found here. And that it was a bird that's smaller than an eagle, but bigger than a magpie.
Okay.
And that
a raptor of some kind that.
And that it was important to them. And this is one of those different worldviews, right? If you are children of the large-beaked bird, the name for yourself ties you to the animal community. You're now a child.
Did they have any drawings of what they thought?
Not that I know of. It would be a good thing to look for. And it also means that where the bird traveled, that's your home.
Right.
Because you're children of that animal. So that sense of where it's home is tied to the relation of the animal. It's migrations, it's nestings, it's all of those things. Okay. So here is his great-grandfather. He comes up red. And one of the things about working with Grant, and I think this is common for many traditions, is it great-grandfather, is it great-great-grandfather, doesn't matter. It's just grandfather. It's just auntie. It's just, and so the kinship doesn't need to have the specifics of which generation. And I'm saying this because, did any of you watch the Return of Foretop's Father? Okay, you might hear different references to, it's my grandfather, it's my great-great-grandfather. Anyway, so this is grandfather. He comes up red, who lived a remarkable century, 1847 to 1947. If you think about what that means, he was born near the base of what they called White Tip Bear Mountain, and we have been referring to it as Carter Mountains. So he was born as a Free or Buffalo Indian and died on the reservation. And there's this picture of him near the reservation housing that then was marked the end of his life. And so Grant Bulltail is in his great-grandfather's arms in that picture. So as he comes up red, lost his sight, Grant Bulltail was the child who would walk him to go meet his other friends to go tell stories. And Grant was one of those kids, you know, there are some kids that are the rememberers. And they've got that, they pay attention to stories, and the circle of elder men would test him on how well he knew them. And they realized that he was special for having that kind of a memory. And so he got the name Sits Among the Buffaloes, because if you were looking for Grant, he was probably sitting out there with these older men in a circle. So he sits among the buffaloes. Let's go. So when we think about Heart Mountain, this picture is meant to depict for you a little bit of the deep, deep history. So this is going back geologically. So let's take a big step back in time. Heart Mountain has at the very top of it the oldest rock. So you can think of this in some ways as the upside down mountain compared to the way mountains are normally built, which is that the youngest would be on top and it gets pushed up. But in this case, a huge 4 to 5 kilometer thick and even wider bunch of the Beartooth Plateau got broken off and sent violently out and across this landscape. And so there are chunks of it that are in the Sunlight Basin, chunks of it on the road to Yellowstone, and the chunks that are on the top of this mountain. And as Wyoming's fierce winds then cut away and swirl away the basins between our ranges.
You say violently, what do you mean?
That because of volcanic activity and eruption and glacial till, it was, they think this is one of the most remarkable movements of rock, and it's called a clip, Klippe, that geologists know about. So it's the kind of thing you might find in a Geo 101 book showing you what a clip is, because it's one of the famous ones. Now, what that also means on the landscape is that you can see it as the winds eroded the sedimentary layers underneath, the younger layers. You get this broadly shouldered peak that can be seen for hundreds of miles away. That means it oriented people. If you were coming down from Montana, you knew between the Beartooth Range and Heart Mountain that this was going to bring you to the Teepee's Doorway, what the crow called the Teepee's Doorway, which is that canyon between where we put the dam, right? And that river was the way to get into Yellowstone, which was a major source of the trading networks. And so it was you wanted to know where the Teepee's Doorway was so that you could get to Yellowstone and be part of the trading that happened in there. And for many tribes, this is another unique thing about the mountain. It's got the name Heart Mountain or Buffalo Heart Mountain, and it didn't get renamed Carter or Hayden or any of those names of white explorers. It kept its name. And Buffalo Heart Mountain, because if you had a gut pile, then you would place the heart on top of it, because the heart is a prestigious part of the animal, understood to be given to the person most deserving or most in need of strength. And so this looks from a distance like a gut pile with the heart on top. So it's Buffalo Heart Mountain in that rendition. I like to think of this as a metaphor of the current status of indigenous cultural revitalization, in that the oldest rock got broken from its homeland and sent across the kind of rumbling technologies of horse, railroads, cavalries, guns, that and get left out in desolate landscapes where the sedimented settler layers, the reservations lie on top of somebody else's demarcation of where does territory begin and end. But that now, over time, we're starting to see them ourselves as orienting points for an older story that can talk to us about a connection to a landscape that can actually adopt you, which is why it's Foretop's father, is that this mountain is understood to have adopted the crow. So that, I think, stands as a metaphor for one of the things from the Killers of the Flower Moon film. We're in a moment now where understanding that there are really powerful old stories that might promise us a viable future in terms of a human relationship to the land and its energy. All right, so here's our beloved Wyoming. You can see the kind of dashed, right, there we go. And then Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota. And you get a sense here of the wildness and variety of territories. And these are already territories that are impacted by westward expansion, right? So that there's a bit of an accordion pressure from the California and West Coast and the East Coast pushing what becomes called the Plains Indian era, right? But this gives you a sense of the kinds of people in this region who have stories. And so if we think about Saratoga, you guys maybe will be able to tell me, what is the indigenous traditions that are either most recent or most rich?
I'm ashamed to say we don't have them, at least not publicly. The only one I'm aware of is the Indian bathtubs. Supposedly up on one of our, in the Sierra Madres, about where the E of the Wind River Shoshone is. So in that mountain range, there's a hike you could take up to, and on top of the cliffs, there's some natural rock formations. And the story goes, that's where the Indians would take their baths.
And
This is a bunch of hoo-ha-ha, because nobody's gonna haul water up that high.
And I would say that's the kind of story inheritance I had as a kid growing up in Cody. We had places in town that we called the Indian trails. So the word Indian was the word that we all used. And in these very minor ways, we kept the memory of the people who had been here only 2 generations ago. But we did not learn, I did not learn about Crow presence in this region. I could not have named for you the 14 tribes most likely to have known Heart Mountain. These are things that I think our new social studies standards are going to help us address. But again, that's why it's an exciting time now. But I certainly did not grow up learning to any degree the sense that we're 2 generations away from people who were born free here.
I have since, having hiked that trail a couple of times, I'm thinking, okay, nobody's taking a bathtub up here, but it would have been a great lookout for the deer herd and elk herd, buffalo, or buffalo, to find your supper.
And that's exactly what happens once you start, I think once you start restoring the history of the indigenous presence, is that then every ridge line of Wyoming becomes a site where somebody may have been looking for food or may have been trying to build protection. And I don't know about you all, but I certainly have conversations there with persons trying to receive and value their heritage when I'm in those places. And to me, again, living in a world of worlds, that feels right. That feels right to try to restore and be part of the restoration of those heritages. Let's go to the next slide. By the 1851 treaty, now we've got Wyoming happening along here, right? So there's Cheyenne, we're up here around, there's Heart Mountain about there.
So between the R and the O in Absaroka.
Thank you, yes. And Absaroka Mountains is a misnomer of Upsala,
Okay.
right? And it does not look like we're pronouncing, but like we should pronounce it. That's right, that's right. And so we're in that territory, right, of lost in translation. And so I think most people in Park County, if you ask them, where's the name Absaroka come from Absaroka Mountains, might say it's a Shoshone word because we think of our Indians as those on the Wind River Indian Reservation, making it most likely, right? So it's amazing how the straight line between Wyoming and Montana created this division in the settler imagination about whose Indian names belonged where. But instead, when we think about these fluid land-based boundaries, you can see that most of the boundary of this 1851 treaty is all about the land base, so that up here, right under the word Yellowstone River, you're following the Continental Divide, right? So the land is telling you where does the treaty end. You've got the Musselshell River here on the north. The river is telling you more about it. We can see the places where a straight line was drawn to try and just make a connection between that and the Powder River, right? And so there's a territory that is marked by land determining your territory rather than straight lines generally. So that's about 33 million acres, yeah.
And would it not also have been, for lack of a better phrase, the supermarket? Because a lot of the Plains tribes moved seasonally because there were berries, there were animals, there may have been plains. And so that reservation confinement has no relationship to reality.
That's right. And that,
Excuse me, is that?
yes, and that I think two places you can find that this also represents a pleasurable world because travel is good. You have seasonal favorites. You could go look for the Bitterroot at this time. You'd go look for other people for a rendezvous at a different time. I shouldn't say rendezvous, that marks it as the contact kind of event, but times when the trading would be at its best. In the spring, chances to exchange goods as well as meet people to couple with. And so I think that's one of the great things I kept learning from Grant Bulltail was that part of what interests him is having a pleasurable life, a good life. And that movement is part of that. And seasonal movement is part of that. And that's part of what he wanted to be able to restore because everyone desires a pleasurable life. So, and that movement is one of the great pleasures. So that's approximately 33 million acres. And then because Heart Mountain is there right about the R of Absaroka Mountains or Absaroka Mountains, you can see that this was well within the regular zone of their travels. Okay, go ahead if you would.
And that's the Absaroka tribe we were talking about.
Yes. And I'll tell you, I've come around, and Warren might be able to also speak to this, I will use Absaroka and try to use that word with an audience to get our words, our tongues to wrap around it, to hear it, as part of what it means to be I mean, in terms of Wyoming Interfaith Network, a respectful person. But also the word Crow is on their flag, right? It's the Great Crow Nation. The word Crow is in their constitution. So again, as people who are living in the aftermath of being conquered, they deal with, they don't just get to insist that now they're the Apsalica. It's going to take time to undo the Crow, and some things are just not the priority. So the Crow people will call themselves Crow. Documents, flags will use the word Crow. It's kind of like the word Indian. A lot of people I know are very comfortable with talking about Indian country. You're in Indian country now. So is it Indian? Is it Native American? Is it indigenous? I tend to use the word indigenous as a sign of a international alliance of persons who have ancestral ties to land, who experience conquest, right? So indigenous people of Australia, indigenous people of Canada, indigenous people, and that they have come together at an international level. So the term indigenous for me also signals a fairly recent development. I'm not trying to use the old word. I'm using the modern 1970s is the first time at the United Nations you have an indigenous peoples gathering. So it marks this kind of global effort to restore themselves in a relationship to their lands. So I tend to use indigenous and to signal that global experience. And then I'm quite happy moving back and forth between Apsalica and Crow, but I do try to signal and stumble with the words that I'm trying to learn as a way of being in the world, so that other people had to learn how to live with our words, and I'm trying to learn how to live with their words. So from the 33 million acres that we saw in the previous slide, that's this outer boundary on this more simple slide. And you can see that from 1851 to 1904, the smallest little section there, how in about 50 years, the community experienced a loss of land that brought them down to about 3 million acres. And even internally within it, due to the allotment years, there's a checkerboard where people have sold their land to non-pro people. And so that even the like 2.3 million acres has a checkerboard within it. So that is the kind of land loss dispossession that the community experienced. And it means loss of movement. In the earliest days, you had to have a permit to leave the reservation even. And that one of the most devastating parts of the experience was the truncation of your movement and the loss of those pleasures. So I want to give you a bit of what I understood to be, because I use the word theology also in a comparative frame, right? That means I can look at even Buddhist theology, a tradition that does not have a deity, a theo, but the thinking that articulates matters of ultimate concern, kind of coming out of a Paul Tillich description of theology. So I'm going to read this out loud because I think Grant had such a way with words. And so he wrote in a letter to me about Akbahi Lashe, the ultimate source. The Apsalica were thoroughly overwhelmed by Akbahi Lashe, a conviction of a force that does the overcoming and whose powers are limitless. The quality of ultimate source caused the Apsalica to acknowledge that this entity has final authority over them, and therefore, the convictions with which they deal with nature and the universe are valid and binding, permanent, and sacred. So I saw in that what I thought was one of the most profound descriptions of a holistic relationship to land and to each other. And that in a time of late capitalism, like we live in, this is a world that strikes me as capable of providing an ethic for a viable human future. It's
And the people as well as the land and the animals, but also the higher power. The God being, it's all connected.
exactly. And he ultimately chose the language of energy rather than creator, although he also tells stories about the creator because they had creator stories. But he moved to the language of energy. And what's quite interesting is that also these days, in a field called new materialism, we have theologians who are looking at relativity physics and plasticity of the brain, and they too are understanding a human relationship to the energetic power of the universe. So I'm happy to stick with Voltaire's version of this, but there's a lot of people right now who are interested in thinking about the exchange of energy as actually a way of understanding the relationship to the creation. So there's sister conversations happening globally by people who are interested in not using an anthropomorphic language of a he or a person, but rather an energetic language as the marker of our relationship to the world.
As just an aside, will you make these slides available to us? Is that possible?
I think it's possible, and
Because I would like to, and I saw her taking a picture of it, and I'm like, I want.
and do I need to write it all down now, or can we get it later?
Why don't I send that picture to the group chat?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's, and this is a antelope herd on the north side of Heart Mountain, a picture taken by Rob Colling, who's a Powell photographer. Okay, let's go. Let me see.
I could spend all day doing this stuff.
So here's one more of kids, because again, I think this is a chance for you all to get immersed in somebody else's world. The operation of man upon nature are so insignificant that man's feeble attempts to change nature do not vary the energy in nature. The energy in nature is less grand when man attempts to mold nature to his level, but it never shuts down and does not dissipate, only diminishes. The energy level in nature is essential to its perfection. The divine beauty in nature and the love of man to nature is that which is found in combination with the human will and never separate. We are taught by this will that nature's affiliated to every individual ever born. And again, as a theological message, he does not put humans as bad things, but says that they have always been part, and their will has always been part of the relationship to nature, and that every human being has an affiliation to that ethical relationship. So a little bit, yeah, let's go ahead then. And so when we wrote our first, one of the things he wanted to do was hold a pipe ceremony. He's a member of the Tobacco Society, which is a, you might call it an esoteric society. You get invited into it and then trained in the services. And the pipe is understood to have been a gift from the Creator to humans so that they might remember to look up. The pipe will send the smoke up. And when you do a pipe ceremony, you should lift the pipe up and offer it to the 4 directions and give a prayer about what each of those directions means. And this way, humans wouldn't forget to look up. And also they would be trying to send some energy back, right? Because that human will should be part of the perfection of nature's energy. And so the Tobacco Society implies that humans have a relationship to return energy to the creation to help perfect it. And so once Nature Conservancy had bought Heart Mountain, and that opened the mountain as a land trust to people, he wanted to then offer a pipe ceremony there. So for the first one back in 2011, these are his words that we sent out as part of an invitation. The Crow people, living so close to nature with logical inference, observed the universal and permanent quality of energy that is nature. By sacrifice and prayer, those are things where you are giving energy, right? You're part of an exchange relationship of energy, sacrifice and prayer. The Crow people become part of this energy. The Crow people who achieved this energy have achieved sufficient prominence throughout the history of the Crow people to serve as widespread models for other Crow people and as objects of admiration. And this constitutes a loose boundaried canon in an ultimate source of energy. So he's telling us they have canons. And the canons are the story about the people whose lives were admirable and their community acknowledged them for their leadership. The faith in an ultimate source of energy arouses the sense of order and the emotion of the group. As an understanding of how a community might be strong, in that they might have a shared sense of order, which develops an emotion that ties you ethically together in a relationship with the land. This just, again, when we think about our time, this is an ethos for a viable human future.
It reminds me of scripture that when we pray, we raise a fragrance to heaven.
Yeah.
I'm not quoting it
Yeah.
correctly, but as soon as I listened to that, that just is
And
instantaneous, that connection.
it's one of the things that I feel like in the Western tradition, we may have grown to think of that as a priest's job, or that it's got a specific place and
At
order
time.
and time that it has to be done in order to be right, and you have to be the person with the right authority to do it, rather than part of a daily, seasonally, yearly cycle of actually connecting yourself in an energetic relationship of responsibility. So I think in some ways, some of Grant's language can actually open us onto our own traditions, and the fact that this was not just rote liturgy, but this is an opportunity for connection, and we have a responsibility to be in an exchange relationship of giving our own energy to its perfection. Yeah.
Hey, Mary, just to point out that the other thing here is that in the white culture, we still have that tradition of incense,
Yes,
burning of incense.
yes.
But boy, you try to do it in a Christian church.
It doesn't fly
Bring
well.
people out.
People would have churches like Catholics do.
Catholics do it, Orthodox do it.
Yeah.
But
But
You
yeah.
don't even have to
process,
wait
yeah.
anything. Somebody sees you doing it, they start coughing, you know? So we need to learn that tradition too.
And in their case, it would always be done outside.
Ah.
So you've got the freedom to move away if you, right, and.
Yeah.
Not affecting your breathing.
Yeah. And so the winds are, and once it's part of an energetic circulation, right, so,
As you know, we still do it for animal blessings.
Yes.
We do that outside.
Yeah.
The animals with the incense.
yes, yeah, exactly.
And the process of smudging.
Is very much in that same, and it also, the smudging suggests we all have a little bit of crap inside us. And that there's an opportunity to try to empty oneself and be purified.
Yeah.
And that it is a plant that would do that. And it, right, so that again, now you're in an energetic relationship where the plant can actually help you heal from those things which are causing your illusions and sufferings, yeah. So here's the end of the invitation letter for the first one, because he had big aspirations for this. Those of us who see the beauty and energy in nature must gather at Heart Mountain, Foretop's father, on June 11th, 2011. In proportion to the energy in our thoughts and will, we shall take up the energy of the world to a new level. He really understood the possibility for people who see the beauty and energy. And he, like all of us, knows there's not that many of us who are looking, who are really concerned with this kind of thing. But those of us who do should gather together, and we have a responsibility.
And was he thinking outside his own tribe and Native
Absolutely.
Americans?
That's why the invitation is to those of us who see the beauty, is it would be beyond the Apsalika tribe, beyond just tribes. He knew we live in a moment where we need to be aligning ourselves with those who share. But he also says it in that positive language of beauty, right? It's not to those of us who see that everything's going to hell, we've got it. He wanted to make an event that was about beauty. And that's why you have dancers there. That's why you have singers. And any of you who have been in a room where there's a drum circle, you probably know that kind of, as that starts, the drum, and then as that kind of a singing, it just speaks to me that, and my people don't have that tradition.
Right.
And it's kind of spine chilling when it's happening. So that's about building energy. So he didn't want to perform for white people at this. That's not why you have dancers and singers. This is not about performance. This is about energy building. And your regalia for dancing is beautiful because you want beauty. You're wanting to raise the level of the experience up to beauty. And you're wanting the power and intensity of the drum circle. So at the first one, Grant here on the left, you can see he's being aided by Jonathan Pretty on top in lighting the pipe. And on the right, you see his wife, Linda Boltable. In the Crow tradition, in order to speak in front of a group, you have to be given that authority by your community. And there is a gender hierarchy that means that Grant gave Linda the authority on that day to be presenting and talking about pro-women's lives. But it was also always important to him, he was walking in two worlds. He wanted Linda to speak, he wanted to respect tradition, and so by giving her the authority to be there, then the women's perspective is brought in. Okay. And so here we see him as he collects himself, and then he will raise it to the four directions. And just another shot of Linda. We are at the trailhead to the Heart Mountain hike on the Nature Conservancy. And pictures from this first event then made it into the interpretive cabin there, the trapper's cabin. And so Linda Bulltails and some of these other pictures are part of Nature Conservancy's presentation of what they do. And that makes me feel actually kind of proud of this event as having started to restore presence.
And connection.
Yeah. And so part of what the first event was attempting to do was to build energy, and that's why we had dancers there and singers there, and to forge alliances. And this is Carrie. I'm forgetting her last name. And she was the manager of the Nature Conservancy properties there at the time.
I
So
know her maiden name, can't think of her.
exactly,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. Peters,
Thanks, Peters.
Carrie Peters, thank you. And with her little one there, so I have to admit, I love that picture.
Sorry.
No, this is good. We'll keep going. And so we also had Jerome Huggs, and he at the time was working at the Chief Plenty-Coup Museum. So he spoke to us about the work that how Plenty-Coup and their work related to this effort. And we had our first speaker from the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. And every year we've had a speaker from the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. They have been so interested in not only restoring and telling the story of the Japanese American internment, but the connection of the removal of Indigenous people and relocation of Japanese American people as both constitutive of the American story. And so again, now we've got a place that has so many cultural layers, this world of worlds. Okay, go ahead. And so we were bringing the energy with us, with between the drummers, the dancers, the bishop, the Episcopal Bishop of Wyoming was doing an event up here at TAC, I think that time. And he came and he spoke. Go ahead. So the next steps for Return to Foretop's father is when we look back at this slide, and I'm realizing this is an animated slide, and it's fine that we're not going through that, but for the next one,
Okay,
I'm not sure we'll get it to play, so we'll see.
we'll see.
You tried before, yeah, okay. So that over here where it says FF within the red circle of the lower map, that's about where Return to Foretop's father is. And where it says 10 Sleep, that's about where Nature Conservancy's other property, the Shell Canyon property, exists, that we are now working with other Tobacco Society members to create what I think of here as a larger landscape constellation that would restore to Crow youth especially a sense of their belonging and heritage in this area. So this year, when Noel Two-Leggins, who works at the Little Bighorn Tribal College and has a program called Youth Who Will Become Leaders, he will come and be part of the Return to Foretop's father event, and then he will go from here over to Shell Canyon, and he will work with Trey, who's the Nature Conservancy manager over there, and they will be connecting them to Cloud Peak, and the Bighorns are where, in the origin story of the Crows movement down here, is that it was the dream of a special seed that they needed to find, and they found it on the Bighorns, and that is the tobacco plant seed, the Nicotimus. Are any of you? So there is a
The local variety of tobacco?
yes, yes, and so it's not the green leafy thing of Marlboros. It's a delicate flower, but it's got a little seed that has a cross in the top of it once it's a seed pod. And that's when they knew they had found home was when they found that seed, which had been given to them in a dream. And that's where the Tobacco Society then governs. And this ties them to the very roots of their earliest arrival in the region.
See, because I grew up on the East Coast, I think of green tobacco.
Right.
It's a crop, and I've often thought, how did it make its way across? So you have enlightened me in an issue I've struggled with for.
So it's a sacred plant, it's not just a plant that you smoke, it's
Yeah.
a sacred plant.
Yes, it
Yeah.
was that which told them they were home.
And it's not the same as Kinnickinnick in Colorado.
I could not tell you.
No, Kinnickinnick is on the ground.
Yeah,
This plant has some,
it does have some height,
Yeah.
right? I've tried to grow it a few times.
yeah.
Yes.
It's definitely a stocky
Yes,
plant.
yeah.
It's the best way to describe it.
So our future is trying to build a new relationship with the Tobacco Society members. Grant died in October of 2020, and from COVID. And so we hope that that's our long-term vision, is to create a constellation across northern Wyoming of belonging. And you guys are headed over to Sheridan next, and so you can see how that will be at play. And let's see how this last. I'm gonna skip this one. I think I need to, even though I love that part. So in light of another important issue for me is the human-caused global warming. And one of the impacts that we know about is that those persons with the least infrastructure are the most vulnerable to the crises that erupt from the intensity of the water cycle that our warmer temperatures have created. And this is an image of Pro Agency back in May of 2011, the same year of our first pipe ceremony. So the pipe ceremony was not only attached to a pro notion of energy, but also Grant's concern with ecology and the toll that human will was taking on ecology. And so if we go to our last slide.
Elizabeth, can you send that out to all of us?
Okay.
There we go. And on the left, you're seeing the historical average temperature, 61 to 1990, 1961. Climate people like to work in 30-year increments, because that gives you enough time for some highs and lows to have happened and averaged out a little bit. So on the left side here, we are seeing temperatures, and you can find Wyoming's mountain ranges as the blue spots on the map, and that's where it stays cooler, right? And there we go from Cheyenne up toward Casper, some of the warmest spots of Wyoming, which we know about if you're from there. And then on the right, Emery's going to hit the button for the animation. We are starting, this is the estimated temperature for 2020. And now that it's 2024, I could correct that slide, but I work with a climate scientist who made this for me. So, and we're going to watch as by decade how the temperature looks in Wyoming. So if you'll go ahead and hit that, you can see
Ay, caramba.
how,
Oh, that hurts.
so this is,
Cycle through a few times.
it's going to cycle through a few times just to give you a sense
And I'm already melting.
of, and it's not like we don't know that it's getting warmer, but again, in terms of living in a world of worlds and being persons of faith, I think it's really useful to just imagine futures and how those persons who have the least access to air conditioning or air filtration during times of the fires, or flood prevention when those big heavy clouds hang over Wyoming like they didn't used to and drop rain for 3 days on snow, creating the events that we've had of late. So that what it will mean to live in a world of worlds will, I think, include how are we building relationships with those who are most vulnerable to these warming temperatures. And so with that, I will stop.
Looks like you have to move to the mountains, North Mountains, Mary.
The North Mountains, exactly, yeah.
Mary, one of those tours, the vice president of the, whatever he was at the tribe was there.
Yes,
And you asked me to go with him because he's going to walk to the top. And so I had a nice conversation with him. It turned out not to be so good because he found out he was a big Trump supporter. Because Trump believed in oil and gas, and that's what he.
mhm.
And I thought he was going to die before he got to the top. I mean, it was that.
We thought so. In fact, we sent a vehicle up to rescue him. Yeah.
But that surprised me a little bit. Because I remember talking to him because my son worked chief of staff for John Tester at the time. And I was thinking, well, we'll be a big supporter of Tester who really believes in that. He wasn't. He said Trump was the man. We want him. That was a little scary.
And I think what's wonderful about that point is that Grant was a theologian. He wasn't a politician.
Yeah.
He had his suspicions, and he, as a younger man, had actually worked for Shell, I think, out in
Yeah, he said he
California,
worked for the energy companies, which means gas.
right?
Yeah.
And so, but he had left that to pursue a life of education. And that right now the storytelling, especially, let's say that the slide that shows us those warming temperatures, let's say that there's any anxiety that's provoking.
What, you didn't hear mine?
That in a time of anxiety, when people desire a sense of order that brings them into a feeling of their right relationship to energy, I think Trump has a story that provides an understanding of it's gonna be okay. We can use our energy, we'll benefit from it. We live in a capitalist world. So only some of us have concerns about the kind of beauty and future viability of human relationships to land, and other persons have concerns about how do I employ the most number of people, especially among a low employment suffering community. And so we are in this world of, there is no romantic indigenous place where everyone agrees that's what we should do, just like there's not in any of our towns. But he, like the people who are involved in the voices of faith, I think, are those persons trying to look to the ecological viability. Yeah.
We have a question online, and so Liz says, so much of what you're saying connects to my own spiritual tradition. She's Druid. I would love to connect and talk some more at another time. Do you hold any events or other activities at the university that are open to the public, or anywhere that are open to the public?
Please get in touch. Keller at uwyo.edu. And I would say that in part my friendship with Anne Marie and my continued relationship with Wynn is something I would like to develop more, because at the university, my courses are not this in general. And so that I would think there could be a Wynn kind of space to develop yet. So Liz, let's try to figure out what that could be and how it could have the legs to carry it.
Yeah.
And Liz, you and me can be the Elk Mountain connection. How's that sound? You're on, I bet you're on one side and I'm on the other, but we'll work it. Elk Mountain would be one of those orienting
Yeah.
archaeological spaces.
Yes,
Elk Mountain, Medicine Bow Peak.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm excited. So the event this summer is looking a little different than some of the past ones. Do you want to just give a,
Yeah, rather than trying to invite a wider community, which was always Grant's intention, we are trying to circle in a little bit. I can say I bite off more than I can chew in organizing this thing. And trying to make a deeper and more transformative connection between Nature Conservancy and the Tobacco Society. So that in many ways, I'd like to be able to step back and have Tobacco Society be the ones leading on what is the role between pipe ceremony and Heart Mountain and public facing or internally Indigenous facing ceremony. So I think we are trying to create the space where ceremony enters into land conservation. Nature Conservancy is awesome at the science and the infrastructure for land conservation. Let them do that. But
We need it.
could Tobacco Society now start to build a more formal relationship that allows for ceremonial space that they would like to be leading?
Which is needed too.
Yeah,
well, and especially with the youth,
that's right.
it seems like the youth are a big part of this event in what I've heard so far.
And so the youth who will become leaders had 20 kids in it last year, and this year 70 kids. So the actually creating that niche, and that's Pan Montana youth. So it's not just Crow. So other tribes in Montana saw what Noel was doing and wanted their kids to be part of this sense of pilgrimage. And
I think that's
So
huge.
that is huge.
when is this happening this year?
It'll be July 11th and 12th and 13th. But we are not inviting other people. We're just inviting Nature Conservancy, three pipe, Tobacco Society families, and then up to 70 youth. One of the things I could do better would be to describe that for people who would like to show support in ways that, because we would take contributions.
If you would like to contribute, you can donate to WIN and make a memo that it's for the Crow ceremony or return to Foretop's father, and we will put it towards that event.
The whole mindset that I think we should have it is that this is an important issue. It's all part of creation and all that. I know when we baptized our grandkids, both of them, we went to Lanicue State Park, and they have what's known as the baby spring. It's a spring that pops up outside the house, square house they built Lanicue. But we decided that would be a very sacred place to do a baptism. We did it. It was really, those kids remember that. Special.
I think part of Grant's gift was his persistent seeking of joy, happiness, the pleasures of a good life as a way to talk about these issues. And that as a kid who was born in Sundance and raised in Cody, the place names of my two towns of growing up in Wyoming indicate that I have a relationship to Indigenous people But boy, was Sundance a white town when I was there. I had no sense of Crow presence. I didn't know whose Sundance it was. I knew that we called the mountain nearby Buffalo Mountain. So you get a kind of what one literature professor calls is the unique relationship of white people to Indian names.
Right.
It gives you a kind of burnished flow rather than, I was not raised knowing who were these indigenous communities, how would I be in a right relationship with them? And I would say that's where my spiritual work lies, and in trying to be able to articulate it as a seeking for pleasures, rather than in the language of guilt or responsibility or burden. So as we try to tell stories for a time like ours, where there are a lot of stories right now that are driven mostly out of emotions of fear or anger or resentment, how we tell a story of the pleasures of connection matters.
And speaking of that, how did Grant Foretop, I've always wondered this, get along with Joe Medicine Pro?
They were together at the museum talking, and I can't really speak to that relationship. But I think, I would say they were from different networks.
Mhm.
And so your clan, there are, I forget now how many clans there are within the Crow tribe, but, put you into steady acts of connecting or not, and they were not in
No, okay.
those networks.
Because, Joe Medicine Pro and Senator Tester arranged this. My son worked, got Presidential Medal of Freedom, because of his war acts during the Second World War. He was honored for going behind enemy lines, Germans, and stealing all their horses. Stole horses.
That is very,
And that and some other things, and and I've heard Joe Medicine talk about this up at the college when he was giving stories. He started off by just saying, well, I was in Washington DC, and I was invited for dinner. And this nice man, who was Obama at the time, nice man invited me to dinner, and he gave me this great little thing to put around my neck. He said, you can come to dinner here anytime. And then he went on some other stories. He was a great storyteller.
He was.
A couple of those stories I still remember. And he died just recently.
unfortunately, we've come to the end of our officially allotted time, but this is certainly a conversation we want to continue. Mary Keller, thank you. Dr. Keller, I should say, and thank you from the Voices program. Thank you for everything you do, and not just for us here, but for the students you teach and the people you influence through your work. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And what was your email again?
It's on there, M. Keller.
M. Keller. All right.